Her hands trembled so violently that the paper rattled like dry leaves in wind. Greta Hoffmann, 23 years old, former communications clerk for the Luftwaffe, stood frozen in the afternoon heat of a Texas prisoner of war camp, staring at what the American guard had just placed in her hands: white paper, an envelope, 2 stamps bearing the profile of an American president. For 8 months she had heard nothing from home. For 8 months her mother had no idea if she was alive or dead. And now, impossibly, she was holding the means to break that silence. The tears came before she could stop them, hot and sudden, spilling down her cheeks and onto the precious paper she clutched against her chest. Around her, 24 other German women were crying too, some sobbing openly, others covering their faces with their hands. One woman had collapsed to her knees in the dust, the envelope pressed to her lips like a holy relic. The American guard stood back, silent and visibly uncomfortable, perhaps unprepared for the storm of emotion their simple act of bureaucracy had unleashed. This was not the reaction to paper and stamps they had expected. But for these women, this moment was more than male privileges. It was proof of something they had been afraid to believe, that maybe, just maybe, their captors were not the monsters they had been promised. The road to this moment had begun in chaos and terror. Greta had been captured near Cherbourg in June of 1944, just days after the Allied invasion. She had been part of a communications unit, one of thousands of women serving in auxiliary roles for the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. They had been told repeatedly that if captured by the Americans, they would face unspeakable horrors: torture, execution, worse. The propaganda posters plastered across every German military installation showed American soldiers as savage beasts, barely human, driven by bloodlust and degeneracy. Radio broadcasts warned that female prisoners would be subjected to treatment so vile it could not be spoken aloud. The officers whispered that capture meant death, just slower and more painful than a bullet. So when the Allied forces overran her position, and she found herself with her hands raised, surrounded by American soldiers shouting words she barely understood, Greta had been certain her life was over. She remembered praying not for rescue, but for a quick end. The transport across the Atlantic had been its own kind of hell, though not the hell she had anticipated. The Liberty ship was crowded, dark, and reeked of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. Hundreds of prisoners, men and women separated into different holds, spent weeks crossing an ocean that seemed endless. Many were seasick. All were terrified. At night, lying on a thin blanket in the cargo hold, Greta would hear other women crying softly in the darkness. Some prayed. Others simply stared at the ceiling, their eyes hollow with shock. They had been taught that America was a land of chaos and cruelty, a democracy so weak and corrupted it could barely function. Yet the ship that carried them was enormous, clean, and efficiently run. The food, while simple, was more plentiful than anything they had eaten in months at the front. Guards were stern but not brutal. No one was beaten. No one disappeared in the night. It was confusing, disorienting. Greta found herself wondering if the real torture was this uncertainty, this waiting for the cruelty that propaganda had promised, but that never seemed to arrive. When the ship finally docked in America, the prisoners were loaded onto trains. For days they traveled inland, watching through barred windows as the American landscape unfolded before them. Forests, rivers, cities untouched by bombs, fields stretching to the horizon fat with crops. It was obscene, this abundance. While Germany burned under Allied bombing, while her people starved on ration cards and sawdust bread, America looked like a land from fairy tales. The women whispered to each other in German, their voices tight with disbelief and something darker. Resentment. How could this country, so far from the fighting, so untouched by war's devastation, dare to judge Germany? How could they claim moral authority when they lived in such impossible plenty? The anger helped, briefly, to cover the fear. Texas, when they arrived, was like stepping onto another planet. The heat hit them first, a dry, baking warmth so different from the damp cold of northern France. The sky was enormous, blue and empty to every edge of the world. And the camp itself was not what they had imagined. Yes, there were fences, yes, there were guard towers, but the barracks were clean, newly built with real beds and mattresses. There was running water, latrines that flushed, a mess hall that smelled of food, real food, not the thin gruel they had survived on during their final weeks at the front. The American soldiers who processed them were businesslike, even polite. They were given uniforms, basic supplies, and instructions in broken German about camp rules. No one shouted. No one struck them. Greta kept waiting for the mask to slip, for the true face of American brutality to reveal itself. But day after day, it did not come. The silence was worse than any beating could have been. For the first 3 months of captivity, the women were not permitted to send or receive mail. This was standard procedure, they were told through interpreters, security reasons, processing delays, the logistics of war. But to Greta and the others, it felt like erasure. Back home in Bavaria, her mother would have received a telegram by now, missing in action, presumed captured or dead. The old woman would be alone in their small house, waiting by the window for news that would not come. Greta's father had been killed on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. Her older brother was somewhere in Italy, if he was still alive. Her mother had already buried so much hope. Now she would be burying her daughter too, at least in her heart, having no way to know that Greta still breathed, still ate, still woke each morning to the Texas sun. The not knowing was a special kind of torture. At night, Greta would lie awake and imagine her mother's face. Was she ill? Was she starving? Had the bombs reached their village? Every night brought new nightmares, and every morning brought the same hollow ache of uncertainty. The other women suffered the same torment. Anna, a nurse from Hamburg, had 3 younger sisters. Margaret, a radio operator like Greta, had left behind a fiancé. Ilse had a young son, only 4 years old, being raised by her parents while she served. Each woman carried her own weight of silence, her own unbearable questions. They would gather in the barracks after work details, sitting on their bunks and talk in low voices about home. What did you leave behind? Do you think they know we are alive? Will we ever see them again? These conversations were both comfort and torture, picking at wounds that would not heal. Some women stopped talking altogether, retreating into a shell of grief and guilt. Others became angry, lashing out at guards or refusing to work. But most, like Greta, simply endured, carrying their silence like stones in their chests. The guilt was perhaps the worst part. Germany was losing the war. Everyone knew it, though no one dared say it aloud. The propaganda still blared about final victory, about wonder weapons and the Führer's genius. But the women could count. They could see the numbers. The sheer scale of American operations, the endless supplies, the casual abundance that surrounded them even in captivity. While they sat in a camp in Texas, eating 3 meals a day and sleeping in clean beds, their homeland was being ground to dust. Cities were burning. Children were starving. Soldiers were dying by the thousands. And here they were, prisoners, safe and fed, and removed from all of it. The shame was crushing. Greta felt it every time she ate a meal, every time she woke up without the sound of bombs, every time she looked at the wide Texas sky and felt for just a moment something close to peace. What right did she have to peace when her mother might be digging through rubble? What right did she have to safety when her countrymen were bleeding in muddy trenches? The work helped distract from the guilt, though not enough. The women were assigned to labor details, some in the camp itself, others sent out to nearby farms and ranches. The Americans needed workers. Their own men were overseas, fighting in Europe and the Pacific, and the domestic economy was desperate for hands. So German prisoners filled the gap, harvesting crops, mending fences, doing laundry, cooking meals. The work was hard but not cruel. They were paid small tokens for the camp canteen. They were given water breaks and shade when the heat grew too intense. Supervisors, mostly older American, men or women, treated them with a kind of detached professionalism. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile either. It was so different from what they had expected that many women found it harder to process than outright cruelty would have been. Cruelty they understood. Kindness or even basic decency from the enemy felt like a trap. The first weeks passed in a haze of disbelief and adjustment. Greta learned to recognize the rhythms of camp life. Morning roll call, breakfast in the mess hall where the food was plain but filling, work details that lasted until late afternoon, evening meals, recreation time when prisoners could read donated books, play cards, or simply sit and talk. Lights out at 2200 hours. It was orderly, routine, almost boring, and that very normalcy was disorienting. This was not how imprisonment was supposed to feel. There was no drama, no sadism, no daily struggle for survival. There was just work and food and sleep, day after day, while the war raged on an ocean away. Some women began to relax cautiously into this new reality. Others remained tense, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Greta was among the latter. She could not shake the feeling that this was all temporary, that eventually the true nature of American captivity would reveal itself. But it never did. Instead, something even stranger happened. The guards began to seem human. There was a young corporal from Oklahoma who always said good morning in terrible German, an older sergeant who reminded Greta of her uncle with the same weathered face and quiet competence, a female administrator who worked in the camp office and always smiled when the women passed by. These were not monsters. They were not the savage Americans of propaganda posters. They were farmers and shopkeepers in uniform, doing a job far from home themselves. Greta hated how much this confused her. It would have been easier if they had been cruel, easier to maintain the walls, the certainty of us versus them. But how do you hate someone who hands you a cup of water on a hot day? How do you maintain righteous anger against people who treat you better than your own army often did? And then, on a Thursday afternoon in late September of 1944, everything shifted. The camp commandant made an announcement during evening assembly. Through an interpreter, he informed the prisoners that male privileges were being granted. Effective immediately, prisoners would be allowed to write one letter per week to family members. Letters would be reviewed by censors to ensure no sensitive information was shared, but otherwise, they could write freely. They could send word home. They could receive replies. The silence was ending. For a moment, no one reacted. The words seemed too impossible to process. Then someone gasped. Then someone else began to cry. And within seconds, the entire assembly had dissolved into chaos as women wept, embraced, and called out in German, voices overlapping, in a cacophony of disbelief and relief. The next morning, they lined up outside the camp administration building. Each woman received a single sheet of white paper, an envelope, and 2 stamps. The American officer handing them out had clearly not anticipated the response. As each woman took her paper, tears began to fall. Some thanked him in broken English, voices choked. Others simply clutched the paper to their chests and walked away, shoulders shaking with sobs. Greta stood in that line, watching women ahead of her break down, and felt her own control crumbling. When her turn came and the paper was placed in her hands, the weight of 8 months of silence crashed over her all at once. She tried to say thank you. The words would not come. She took the paper, the envelope, the stamps, and walked back to her barrack in a daze. Other women were already sitting on their bunks, hunched over makeshift writing surfaces, pens moving furiously across paper. Some wrote in silence, others whispered aloud as they wrote, as if speaking to the loved ones they addressed. Greta sat on her bunk and stared at the blank page. 8 months of things to say. A lifetime of fear and hope and guilt and relief. And only one small sheet of paper to hold it all. Where did she even begin? The pen felt foreign in her hand, as if she had forgotten how to hold one. Greta sat on the edge of her bunk, the precious paper resting on a borrowed book to create a flat surface, and tried to steady her breathing. Around her, the barracks had fallen into an almost sacred quiet, broken only by the scratch of pens on paper and the occasional sniffle as someone paused to wipe away tears. 32 women, all writing the most important letters of their lives, all trying to compress months of fear and separation into a single page. Greta stared at the blank space before her. "Dearest Mama," she finally wrote, the words shaky. "I am alive." For a long moment she could write nothing else. Those 3 words seemed both insufficient and overwhelming. How do you tell your mother that you survived when she has spent months believing you dead? How do you explain where you are, what has happened, without causing more fear. Greta closed her eyes and thought of her mother's face, the lines around her eyes, the silver in her hair, the way she always smelled of bread and lavender soap. The ache in her chest was physical. The ability to send mail was not a kindness, though it felt like one in that moment. It was a requirement under the Geneva Convention of 1929, an international agreement that outlined the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States, unlike many nations fighting in this war, had chosen to follow these rules with almost obsessive precision. Article 36 of the convention stated clearly that prisoners must be allowed to send and receive correspondence. The delay of 8 months had been partly logistics, the chaos of processing thousands of new prisoners, establishing proper channels, coordinating with the International Red Cross, and partly security, ensuring that no sensitive military information could be leaked through careless letters. But now the system was in place. Camp administrators had established a review process. Trained censors would read every letter before it left the camp, redacting anything that violated security protocols. It was not perfect privacy, but it was connection. For women who had felt erased from the world, it was everything. The camp commandant, a Colonel Warren Hayes from Pennsylvania, had explained the rules through an interpreter the evening before. Each prisoner would be allowed to write 1 letter per week, not to exceed 2 pages. Letters must be written in German, as censors had been specifically trained to read that language. No codes, no hidden messages, no information about camp locations, troop movements, or military operations. Violations would result in the letter being destroyed and privileges suspended. But personal news, messages of love and reassurance, descriptions of daily life, all of this was permitted. Hayes had been matter-of-fact in his delivery, treating it as routine administration. But he must have seen the way the women's faces changed as he spoke, the way hope, fragile and almost painful, began to bloom in eyes that had been dead for months. When he finished, he had paused, then added something the interpreter translated with visible emotion. Tell your families you are safe. Tell them you are treated well. They deserve to know. Several women had wept openly at those words. Permission to tell the truth, even a censored truth, felt like a gift beyond measure. Writing that truth, however, proved harder than any of them anticipated. Greta stared at her opening line and tried to think of what to say next. I am in America. I'm in a camp in Texas. I'm a prisoner, but I'm not harmed. Every sentence felt absurd. How could she explain that she, a captured enemy soldier, was eating better than most German civilians, that she slept in a clean bed with sheets, that the guards said good morning? Her mother would think she had lost her mind, or worse, that she was being forced to write propaganda. The fear of not being believed paralyzed her. Greta looked around the barracks and saw the same struggle on every face. Anna sat with her pen hovering over paper, lips moving silently as she tried out different phrases. Margaret had written something, then violently crossed it out and started again. Ilse was crying as she wrote, tears dropping onto the page and smearing the ink. This should have been simple. This should have been joyful. But how do you bridge an ocean and 8 months of silence with a single sheet of paper? Greta made herself continue. I was captured in France and transported here. The journey was long, but I was not mistreated. I'm in a camp with other women. We work during the day, simple tasks, and we are given food and shelter. Mama, I know this will sound strange, but I am safe. I am healthy. Please do not worry for me. She paused, reading back what she had written. It sounded insane, cheerful almost, as if she were writing from a holiday rather than captivity. But it was the truth. She added quickly, I think of you every day. I pray you are well, and that the house still stands. Please write to me if you can. Tell me everything. I need to know you are alive. The words came faster now, the dam breaking. She wrote about small things, safe things, the Texas heat, so different from Bavarian cold, the food which was plain but filling, the other women who had become like sisters in their shared captivity. She wrote about missing home, about remembering father and hoping her brother was safe. She wrote until the page was full, her handwriting growing smaller to fit everything in. At the bottom, she signed it, Your daughter who loves you more than words can say, Greta. Then she folded it carefully, slipped it into the envelope, and wrote her mother's address in careful block letters. Frau Helga Hoffmann, Rosenstrasse 12, Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. It felt surreal to write that address here, in Texas, and believe it might actually reach home. The censorship process was explained to them the next morning when they submitted their letters. A young American lieutenant, who spoke fluent German with a slight Bavarian accent that startled everyone, collected the envelopes and outlined what would happen next. Each letter would be read by trained personnel. Anything that violated security protocols would be redacted with black ink, or the entire letter would be rejected. If a letter was rejected, the prisoner would be notified and given a chance to rewrite it. Approved letters would be bundled and sent through the International Red Cross postal system, which handled all prisoner mail on both sides of the war. From there, letters would travel by ship to Europe, then by whatever rail or truck lines still functioned in war-torn Germany. The lieutenant paused, his expression softening. He told them the truth they already suspected. This would take time, months possibly. Germany's infrastructure was collapsing under Allied bombing. Roads were destroyed, rail lines cut, postal systems barely functioned. Even if their letters reached the distribution centers, there was no guarantee they would reach specific addresses. Some of your families may have been evacuated, he said gently. Some addresses may no longer exist. But the Red Cross will do everything possible to deliver your letters, and if replies come, we will ensure you receive them. The wait began immediately and was its own form of torture. Greta handed over her letter with shaking hands and watched it disappear into a canvas mail sack. Somewhere in there were 31 other letters, 31 other desperate attempts to reach across an impossible distance. She tried to calculate the timeline. 2 weeks to reach a port. 4 to 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic, depending on convoy schedules and the submarine threat. Then, however long it took to sort and distribute through whatever remained of the German postal system. 3 months minimum. Maybe 4, maybe never. The thought that her letter might sink with a torpedoed ship or burn in a bombed rail yard or simply vanish into the chaos of a dying regime was almost unbearable. But there was nothing to do but wait and hope, and try not to let that hope destroy her. In the days that followed, the mood in camp shifted subtly. The women seemed lighter somehow, as if the simple act of writing home had released some terrible pressure. There was more laughter during meals, more conversation during recreation time. Even the work details felt less oppressive. Greta noticed women humming as they worked, something she had not heard since capture. The guards noticed too. One of them, the young corporal from Oklahoma, commented through an interpreter that the prisoners seemed happier. "Did the mail help?" he asked. Greta, working nearby, had nodded. "More than you could possibly understand," she had replied. The corporal had smiled, looking pleased as if he had personally arranged the entire Geneva Convention. It was such an American response, taking credit for basic human decency, that Greta had almost laughed. But beneath the surface relief, anxiety churned. Every day without a reply felt like confirmation that something terrible had happened. Maybe her mother was dead. Maybe the house had been bombed. Maybe the letter never arrived at all. Greta found herself calculating obsessively. If her letter left in late September, it might arrive in Germany by early December. If her mother received it immediately and replied the same day, the response might return by March. 5 months from now. 5 months of not knowing if her words had reached home. 5 months of imagining her mother's reaction. Would she cry? Would she collapse with relief? Would she even believe it was real? Greta tortured herself with these thoughts, playing out scenarios in her mind during the long hours of work and the longer hours of night. The other women were equally consumed. Every week they were allowed to write again, and every week they did, pouring out their hearts onto those small pages. Greta's letters became longer as she grew more comfortable with the impossibility of her situation. She described the camp in detail, knowing it would sound like fantasy. She wrote about the mess hall meals, listing the food so her mother would know she was not starving. Potatoes, beans, bread with real butter, sometimes meat, sometimes fruit. She wrote about the work, cleaning and mending and occasionally helping with laundry. She wrote about the other women, these strangers who had become her family. She even wrote, cautiously, about some of the guards, describing their unexpected decency. "I do not understand this country, Mama," she wrote in her fourth letter. "They defeated us, but they do not hate us. Or if they do, they hide it well behind rules and routine. It is not what we were taught to expect. I do not know what to think anymore." Anna wrote to her sisters, 8 pages condensed into 2, telling them about Texas, about heat and dust and horizons that never ended. She begged them to stay safe, to hide if the bombing came, to survive until she could come home. Margaret wrote to her fiancé, though she had no idea if he was still alive or still thought of her as his. Her letters were achingly tender, full of memories and promises and desperate hope. Ilse wrote to her son through her parents, telling the little boy that Mama was safe and would come home someday. She drew pictures in the margins, silly sketches of horses and cowboys, trying to make her captivity sound like an adventure rather than an imprisonment. Every woman had her own way of reaching across the void, her own desperate strategy for maintaining connection to a world that felt increasingly unreal. The mathematics of mail became something everyone understood intimately. Distance mattered. Time mattered. The Atlantic Ocean was approximately 5,000 miles across. A Liberty ship could cross it in roughly 40 days, though convoy routes added time for zigzagging to avoid U-boats. From American ports to European ports, then through the Red Cross distribution system in neutral Switzerland, then into Germany itself, where infrastructure crumbled more every day. The women calculated and recalculated, trying to determine the absolute minimum time a round trip might take. 3 months was the most optimistic estimate. 4 or 5 months more realistic, 6 months possible if things went wrong. Some letters might never arrive, some replies might never be sent. The war was not over, ships still sank, rail lines still burned, people still died. Every day of silence carried the weight of all those possibilities. But they kept writing. Every week, when paper and envelopes were distributed, the women lined up eagerly. They wrote through doubts and fears. They wrote even when they suspected no one would ever read their words, because the alternative, to stop reaching out, to accept the silence, was unthinkable. Writing became an act of faith. Faith that somewhere across an ocean and a war zone, their words would find their way home. Faith that the people they loved still lived and still remembered them. Faith that this nightmare would end and they would see each other again. The paper and the pen were not just tools of communication, they were lifelines. They were proof that even in captivity, even in the midst of the worst war in human history, connection was possible, love was possible, hope was possible. Greta sealed her 5th letter in early November and handed it to the American lieutenant who collected the mail. He had learned many of their names by now and greeted each woman personally as they submitted their letters. "Greta," he said, nodding at her envelope. "Another one for Mama?" She nodded back, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. He added it to his collection with care, as if he understood the weight each envelope carried. "It will get there," he said in his accented German. "I believe that." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that somewhere in the chaos of a dying empire, her words would find their mother and bring comfort. But belief was hard. Trust was hard. All she had was hope, fragile and fierce, that somehow love could survive even this. The first reply arrived on a cold morning in late January of 1945. The camp administrator, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patricia Morrison, who handled much of the prisoner correspondence, walked into the barracks holding a single envelope. Her face was carefully neutral, but her eyes held something that might have been sympathy. She called out a name, Margaret Fisher. The entire barracks fell silent. Margaret stood slowly from her bunk, her face drained of color. She walked forward as if in a dream, took the envelope with trembling hands and stared at it. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. Her fiancé's hand. He was alive. She had not dared to hope, and yet here was proof, thin and paper-light, that across an ocean and a war, her words had reached him and he had answered. Margaret's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, clutching the letter to her chest, and sobbed so hard her entire body shook. The other women rushed to her, surrounding her with hands and voices, everyone crying now, because if one letter could arrive, then maybe others would follow. Over the next 3 weeks, more letters came. Not many, not enough, but a trickle that became a stream. Each day, Mrs. Morrison would arrive with a handful of envelopes, and each day she would call out names, and each day the barracks would erupt in tears and embraces as women received word from home. Greta waited with an anxiety that made her physically ill. She watched others receive their letters and felt genuine joy for them, mixed with a gnawing terror that her own would never come. Had her mother received her letters? Was she even alive to respond? The not knowing was worse now than it had been before, because now she knew connection was possible, and the absence of it felt like a judgment. On February 9th, a Thursday afternoon, when Greta had convinced herself that hope was foolish, Mrs. Morrison called her name. Greta Hoffman. For a moment, Greta could not move. Then she was rushing forward, and the envelope was in her hands, and she saw her mother's handwriting, spidery and thin, but definitely hers, and the world tilted sideways. She did not remember sitting down. She did not remember opening the envelope. But suddenly, the letter was unfolded before her, and she was reading words that had traveled impossible distances to find her. "My dearest Greta," her mother wrote, "I received your letter on Christmas Eve. I had been praying by the window when the postman came. When I saw your handwriting, I fell to my knees and thanked God until I had no voice left. You are alive. My daughter is alive. I have read your letter 100 times. I have shown it to everyone in the village. We all wept together. You cannot know what these months have been like. The telegram came in July saying you were missing. I thought I had lost you as I lost your father. But now you have returned to me, if only in words, and that is miracle enough." The relief in those opening lines was overwhelming, but as Greta continued reading, the tone shifted. Her mother's next words were harder, darker. "My child, I am grateful you are safe, but I must tell you how things are here. The bombing has not stopped. Munich was hit again last week. We heard the planes even from here. The village has taken in refugees from the cities, families with nothing but the clothes they wear. Food is scarce. Our rations have been cut again. We receive less than 200 grams of bread per day now, and even that is mixed with sawdust to stretch it further. There is no meat, no butter, no sugar. Your Aunt Maria collapsed from hunger last month. She is recovering but very weak. We are all so tired, Greta. So very tired." Greta's hands began to shake as she read. The contrast was obscene. That very morning she had eaten oatmeal with milk and sugar. She had been given coffee, real coffee, and 2 slices of bread with jam. For lunch there would be soup and more bread, and probably fruit. While her mother rationed sawdust, Greta was gaining weight in captivity. The guilt was crushing, physical, a weight pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She forced herself to keep reading. Her mother continued with news of neighbors and relatives who had died, who had lost sons at the front, who had been evacuated from bombed-out cities. The litany of loss was staggering. Then, toward the end, her mother wrote something that broke Greta completely. "You write that you are treated well, that you have food and shelter and are not harmed. My darling, I believe you, and I thank God for it even as my heart breaks. You are safer as a prisoner in America than we are as free Germans in our own land. That is a truth almost too bitter to speak. But please, my child, whatever you do, stay safe. Do not be eager to return. There is nothing here but ruin and starvation. I would rather know you are alive in captivity than dead in this wasteland we have become. Do you understand what I am saying? Stay where you are. Survive. Come home only when this is over and there is something to come home to." Greta read those lines again and again, unable to process what her mother was asking. Stay in captivity. Prefer imprisonment to freedom. Choose the enemy's care over the homeland's collapse. It was an inversion of everything that should be true, a moral geometry that made no sense and yet made perfect, horrible sense. Her mother was right. Greta was safer here, better fed here, more secure here. The Reich that had promised glory and greatness had delivered only death and destruction, while the enemy that should have brutalized her had given her 3 meals a day and the dignity of correspondence. The propaganda had been shattered beyond repair. Everything they had been taught was a lie, not just exaggeration or spin, but fundamental total lies. And now, Greta had to live with that knowledge, had to reconcile the gulf between what she had believed and what was real. Around her, other women were having similar revelations. Anna's sisters wrote of living in a cellar for weeks while Hamburg burned above them. The firebombing had killed thousands, they said, and the survivors were walking ghosts. "We have no food," they wrote. "The ration cards are worthless. There is nothing in the shops. We eat grass soup and call it dinner." Anna read this aloud to the barracks, her voice flat with shock, and then said quietly, "I had schnitzel for lunch yesterday." Schnitzel. While my sisters eat grass. The absurdity of it hung in the air, too awful for comment. Ilse's parents wrote that her son cried every night for his mother. They tried to explain where she was, but how do you explain captivity to a 4-year-old? "He thinks you are dead," they wrote. It is easier than the truth. They also mentioned that the boy was small for his age, not growing properly. "Not enough food," they explained. "All the children are small now." Ilse read this letter once, then tucked it away and did not speak for 2 days. The letters kept coming through February and into March. Each one brought the same devastating message. Germany was dying, not metaphorically, actually dying. The infrastructure was gone. The economy was collapsed. The food supply was non-existent. Cities were rubble. Millions were displaced. The people were starving, freezing, living in basements and bombed-out buildings, clinging to survival while the Reich's propaganda machine continued to blare about final victory. The disconnect between the official narrative and the reality in those letters was so vast, it became darkly comedic. One woman received a letter from her mother in Berlin describing how they had been burning furniture for heat and eating wallpaper paste for calories. That same day, a propaganda leaflet was distributed in camp, smuggled in somehow, declaring that Germany was on the verge of breakthrough and that American prisoners were suffering terribly in Reich camps. The women read it and laughed, bitter and broken laughter, because what else could they do with lies that enormous? The psychological impact was devastating and irreversible. These women had been raised in the Third Reich, had believed in its mission, had served its war machine. They had not all been ardent Nazis. Many had simply done what was required, but they had believed in something. In Germany's strength, in the righteousness of their cause, in the idea that they were fighting for survival against enemies who wished them destroyed. But the letters made clear that the destruction was self-inflicted. The regime had spent its people like ammunition, burning through lives and cities in pursuit of a delusion. And now, with defeat inevitable, the leadership was content to let the entire nation starve rather than surrender with dignity. Meanwhile, the enemy that should have annihilated them was feeding them, housing them, allowing them to write home. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Some women stopped eating, unable to swallow food while their families starved. Others ate with a fury born of survivor's guilt, as if gaining strength in captivity could somehow balance the weakness of loved ones at home. None of it made sense. None of it was fair. In late March, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Morrison approached a group of women during recreation time and told them, through an interpreter, that if they wished, they could send small care packages home. The American Red Cross had established a program allowing prisoners to purchase and send food parcels to family members in Germany. The packages would be small, limited to 5 pounds, and the contents restricted to non-perishable items, but they could be sent. The cost would be deducted from the prisoner's small work wages. The women stared at her in disbelief. Send food home? To Germany? From captivity in America? The irony was so sharp, it cut. But within hours, every woman in camp had signed up for the program. They pooled their meager earnings, prioritizing packages over anything else. The canteen purchases stopped entirely. No one bought cigarettes or candy or small luxuries. Every cent went toward sending food home. Greta sent her first package in early April, 5 pounds of dried goods, powdered milk, sugar, coffee, tinned meat, dried beans. She packaged it with hands that would not stop shaking, imagining her mother receiving it. The reversal was complete, the prisoner feeding the free, the captive sending aid to the homeland. When she sealed the package and handed it to Mrs. Morrison, she felt something break inside her. This should not be possible. This should not be necessary. but it was both, and that fact contained within it the entire truth of the war's ending. Germany had lost not just militarily, but morally, economically, structurally. The nation that had promised to dominate Europe for 1,000 years could not feed its own people and had to rely on charity from enemy prisoners. The relationships with the American staff deepened through these months of mail. Mrs. Morrison became something more than an administrator. She learned the women's names, their stories, the contents of their letters. She cried with them sometimes, particularly when letters brought news of deaths. She expedited packages with a speed that suggested she understood their importance. The young lieutenant who collected outgoing mail, whose name they learned, was Thomas Brenner, and whose family had emigrated from Germany 2 generations ago, began sharing news from the front. Not officially, but in quiet conversations, letting them know when cities fell, when the lines moved. He was gentle in his delivery, understanding that every Allied victory was a German defeat, and many of these women still had brothers and fathers fighting. The guards, too, became more human. The corporal from Oklahoma brought his wife to visit one Sunday, and she spent 2 hours teaching some of the women to make biscuits properly. A sergeant from New York shared newspapers, pointing out articles about relief efforts being planned for post-war Germany. These small kindnesses, these gestures of recognition, did more to destroy the propaganda's hold than any amount of official programming could have. The mail itself became a form of unintentional psychological warfare. The American authorities did not plan it that way, but the effect was undeniable. Every letter from home reinforced the same message. America's strength was real, and Germany's was exhausted. The comparison was stark in every line. American prisoners writing about adequate food while German families wrote about starvation. American prisoners describing heated barracks while German civilians described freezing and ruins. American prisoners sending care packages while German infrastructure collapsed. The lesson was taught not through propaganda, but through the lived experience of correspondence. By May of 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached the camp, not a single woman was surprised. They had known for months that the war was lost. Their letters had told them so. Some women shared their letters aloud during evening gatherings in the barracks. It became a ritual of sorts, a way of processing the impossible gap between their two realities. Anna read from her sister's descriptions of Hamburg's destruction, the firestorms that had consumed entire neighborhoods. Margaret read from her fiancé's account of the front collapsing, units surrendering en masse, officers disappearing in the night. Ilse shared her parents' pleas to stay safe in America, to not rush home, to wait until there was something worth returning to. Each letter was a testament to how thoroughly the world had inverted. The free envied the imprisoned. The homeland begged its daughters to remain in captivity. Mothers told their children that enemy care was preferable to homeland loyalty. These reversals, spoken aloud in the soft Texas evening, became a kind of liturgy, a recitation of truths too painful to hold alone. By the time spring turned to summer in 1945, the mail had accomplished what no amount of Allied propaganda could have achieved. It had destroyed absolutely the myth of German superiority and American weakness. These women, who had once believed they served the greatest nation on earth, now understood with brutal clarity that they had been sacrificed to a delusion. Their families were starving while they were fed. Their cities were rubble while American cities stood untouched. Their countrymen were broken while their captors were strong enough to be generous. The letters had forced them to confront a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat. They had been lied to about everything, and the cost of those lies, measured in the hunger and suffering described in every letter from home, was almost too enormous to comprehend. The paper and ink that had seemed like such mercy had delivered a verdict more final than any court could pronounce. The war was over. Germany had lost. And they, the prisoners, were the lucky ones. That summer, as the full scope of Germany's surrender became clear, the women in the Texas camps began preparing for a return they both longed for and dreaded. The war had ended in May, but repatriation was a massive logistical undertaking that would take months to coordinate. Ships had to be requisitioned, processing centers established, documentation prepared. The women were told to expect departure sometime in late autumn or early winter. In the meantime, they continued working, continued writing, and tried to prepare themselves emotionally for what they would find when they finally went home. The letters that arrived during those months carried a new urgency. Their families, knowing the prisoners would soon return, wrote with brutal honesty about what awaited them. Greta's mother sent a letter in July that began with a warning. "My darling, you must prepare yourself. The village you remember no longer exists, not physically destroyed, but changed beyond recognition. Half the houses stand empty, their occupants dead or displaced. The church lost its roof in a bombing raid last winter. The square where you played as a child is now used as a burial ground for refugees who died on the road. When you come home, you will not recognize this place. More importantly, you must prepare for what you will see in me. I am old now, Greta, truly old. I have aged 20 years in these past 5. I am thin, so thin and weak. Do not be shocked when you see me. I am still your mother, just worn down by this terrible war." Greta read that letter and wept for hours. She tried to write back with encouragement and hope. But what could she say? That everything would be fine? They both knew better. Instead, she wrote practical things, promises to bring food from her care package allotment, assurances that she was strong and could help rebuild, descriptions of skills she had learned in camp, sewing and mending and organizing, that might be useful in the reconstruction ahead. She wrote as if purpose could somehow bridge the gap between the daughter who had left in 1944 and the woman who would return in 1946. But she knew, they all knew, that the person who went home would not be the same person who had been captured. Too much had changed. Too much had been revealed. The letters had seen to that. The final months in camp took on a strange quality, suspended between two worlds. The women were no longer quite prisoners, but not yet free. Work details continued, but felt less urgent. Guards relaxed the rules slightly, allowing more recreation time, more social interaction. The fences remained, but seemed less substantial somehow, as if everyone understood they were now just formalities. Greta spent those months reading and rereading every letter her mother had sent, memorizing them, trying to construct a mental image of what she would find. 23 letters in total, spanning from January to October of 1945. Together they formed a chronicle of Germany's collapse and slow, painful beginning of recovery. Her mother's handwriting had grown shakier with each letter, the paper thinner, the words more sparse, as if even ink was rationed. The last letter, dated October 3rd, was only half a page. "I'm counting the days until you come home," her mother wrote. "I have cleaned your room. There is not much in it. We had to burn most of the furniture for heat, but I have saved your bed and the small table. I have also saved every letter you sent me. They are my treasure, Greta, proof that you survived, proof that somewhere in this dark time there was still love and connection. Come home soon, my child. I am waiting." The transport ships began leaving in November of 1945. Groups of prisoners were processed, given discharge papers, and loaded onto vessels bound for Europe. Greta's group departed on November 28th, a cold gray morning when the Texas wind carried the scent of coming winter. The women lined up for final processing, each receiving a small parcel from the American Red Cross containing basic supplies for the journey. Soap, a towel, some tinned food, a thin blanket. Mrs. Morrison was there, overseeing the departure, and she made a point of speaking to each woman individually. When she reached Greta, she took both her hands and held them. "You're going to be all right," she said in careful German she had learned over the past year. "You're strong. Your mother is lucky to have you." Greta tried to thank her, but could not find words adequate to the task. How do you thank someone for helping you maintain your humanity? How do you express gratitude for the simple act of treating you as human during a time when your humanity was supposed to be erased? She squeezed Mrs. Morrison's hands in return, hoping the pressure would convey what words could not. The ship journey back across the Atlantic was nothing like the journey over. The women were no longer terrified prisoners awaiting unknown horrors. They were veterans of a strange captivity, returning home with full stomachs and complicated emotions. Many spent the crossing in silence, staring at the gray ocean and thinking about what lay ahead. Others talked endlessly, rehearsing conversations with family members, planning what they would do first, where they would go, how they would help rebuild. Greta wrote one final letter to her mother during the journey, though she knew it would likely arrive after she did. I am coming home, Mama. I will be there soon. I am bringing food and supplies, and I am bringing myself, changed but still yours. Whatever we face, we will face it together. Wait for me. I'm almost there. She never mailed that letter. She kept it instead, tucked into the bundle of letters from her mother, a bookend to the correspondence that had kept her tethered to humanity during the strangest year of her life. They landed in Bremerhaven in late December, stepping off the ship into a winter wasteland. The port was a ruin, half destroyed by bombing and hasty reconstruction. The city beyond was worse, block after block of rubble and burned buildings, streets filled with refugees and displaced persons, the air thick with the smell of smoke and desperation. The repatriation process was chaos. The Allied authorities had set up processing centers, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of returning prisoners, not just Germans, but people from every corner of the former Reich and occupied territories. It took 3 days for Greta to complete her paperwork and secure travel permits. Then, another week to find transport south toward Bavaria. The trains ran sporadically, their schedules more suggestion than promise. She shared a crowded boxcar with dozens of others, all heading home to uncertain reunions. No one talked much. What was there to say? When Greta finally reached her village in early January of 1946, 17 months after she had last written those words, "Dearest Mama," on a piece of paper in Texas, she almost did not recognize it. Her mother had been right. The village was a ghost of itself, houses damaged or empty, the church with its missing roof, the square transformed into a graveyard. Greta walked through streets she had known since childhood and felt like a stranger. When she reached her house, a small cottage on the edge of the village, she stood outside for a long moment, afraid to knock. Then the door opened and her mother was there, and Greta understood what the letters had tried to prepare her for but could not fully convey. Her mother was ancient, skeletal, her hair completely white, her face a map of suffering. They stared at each other for a heartbeat, two people separated by war and brought back together by the mercy of mail. Then they were in each other's arms, both sobbing, and Greta felt her mother's bones through her thin dress and wanted to rage at the world for what it had done to this woman. They stood in the doorway and cried until there were no tears left, only the reality of survival. "You came back," her mother whispered. "My letters reached you," Greta whispered back. And somehow that exchange, that acknowledgement of connection maintained across impossible distance, was enough. The letters became treasured possessions, kept carefully in boxes and drawers, brought out on difficult days as reminders that even darkness has cracks where light gets through. Greta kept every letter her mother had sent, 23 thin pages that chronicled the war's ending. Her mother kept every letter Greta had sent, 31 pages describing captivity in Texas. Together they formed a double archive, two perspectives on the same terrible time, and the Hoffman family guarded them like sacred texts. Other women did the same. Anna preserved her correspondence with her sisters. Margaret kept every letter from her fiancé, whom she married in 1947, in a ceremony where both bride and groom were so thin their wedding clothes hung loose. Ilse kept the letters from her parents and the drawings she had sent her son, even though the boy, now 6, barely remembered her and called her Frau Ilse, like a stranger. The letters were proof. Proof they had survived, proof they had been loved, proof that in the midst of industrialized death, someone had cared enough to send paper across an ocean. The correspondence did not end with repatriation. Many of the women continued writing to people they had met in Texas. Greta exchanged letters with Mrs. Morrison for the next 15 years, a friendship conducted entirely through mail. Mrs. Morrison sent care packages during the lean post-war years, tins of food and warm socks, and once, memorably, a box of chocolate that Greta shared with the entire village. Greta sent handmade crafts in return, embroidered linens and knitted items, small tokens that could not possibly repay the kindness, but tried to express gratitude. When Mrs. Morrison died in 1961, her daughter wrote to inform Greta, and enclosed in the letter were all the letters Greta had sent over the years, carefully preserved. "Your words meant a great deal to my mother," the daughter wrote. "She often spoke of you and the other women. She believed that the mail program was the best work she ever did. Please keep these letters as a reminder that your lives touched hers deeply. Greta wept reading that, understanding that the connection had been mutual, that her survival and growth had mattered to someone beyond her family. Some women chose not to stay in Germany. The experience of captivity, the revelation of being treated better by enemies than by their own regime, led a number of former prisoners to immigrate to the United States in the years after the war. Anna moved to New York in 1951, sponsored by a relief organization, and worked as a nurse in a hospital there. She married an American, raised 2 children, and spoke of her time in Texas as the experience that saved her life twice, once physically and once spiritually. Margaret and her husband immigrated to Chicago in 1953, seeking a fresh start away from the ruins of Germany. They cited the kindness shown during captivity as proof that America, despite its flaws, was a place where fairness and decency could exist. Their letters back to Germany described a life of abundance that would have seemed impossible in the dark days of 1945. "We have enough," Margaret wrote to friends left behind. "Enough food, enough work, enough hope. It is everything we dreamed of when we were hungry." The letters themselves became historical documents recognized by scholars and archivists as unique windows into the prisoner of war experience. In the 1980s and 1990s, as oral history projects began recording the memories of World War II survivors, several of the women who had been in the Texas camps were interviewed. They brought their letters to these interviews, unfolding yellowed pages and reading aloud passages they had memorized decades earlier. Historians were struck by how different these accounts were from the typical narratives of imprisonment. There was trauma, yes, but also gratitude. There was loss, but also transformation. The letters, with their descriptions of adequate food and fair treatment, stood in stark contrast to the documented horrors of Axis prison camps, where Allied prisoners faced starvation, abuse, and death in shocking numbers. The comparison was not meant to excuse the war or minimize suffering, but to highlight a crucial difference in how the two sides approached captivity. The United States, with all its imperfections, had chosen to honor the Geneva Conventions even when doing so was inconvenient. That choice, maintained through thousands of small decisions like distributing paper and stamps, had literally saved lives and created the possibility of post-war reconciliation. Greta gave her first formal interview in 1992 at the age of 71 to a German television program documenting women's experiences in the war. She brought the box containing all her letters, her mother's, and her own returned correspondence, and spread them on the table before the camera. "These pages," she said, "are the reason I am alive. Not just physically alive, though the food I received in captivity certainly helped, but alive in spirit. The letters kept me human when everything else tried to strip that humanity away. They kept my mother alive, too, giving her hope when hope was scarce. And they taught me something I have tried to remember every day since, that even in the worst of times, small acts of decency matter enormously. A piece of paper, a stamp, permission to write home, these cost the Americans almost nothing. But to us, they were everything." The interviewer asked if she had ever returned to Texas. Greta shook her head. "No, but I have thought about it often. I would like to see that camp again, though I suspect it is long gone. I would like to stand in the place where I learned that enemies can be kind, that propaganda is lies, and that the human need for connection is stronger than any ideology. I would like to thank the people who gave me paper when I had nothing else. But perhaps this interview is that thanks, delivered late but sincere." The broader lesson of the letters resonated beyond individual stories. In the decades after the war, as Germany and the United States worked to build a strong alliance, the treatment of prisoners became part of the foundation for that relationship. Germans who had been held in American camps became unofficial ambassadors, telling their families and communities about the fairness they had experienced. This grassroots testimony, spread through letters and conversations and eventually memoirs, helped counter lingering resentments and made reconciliation possible. The American decision to follow the Geneva Conventions, to allow mail and provide adequate care, had been both morally right and strategically brilliant. It had turned potential lifelong enemies into witnesses for a better way of conducting even the worst of human activities: war. When Greta died in 2003 at the age of 82, her family found the box of letters in her bedroom closet, exactly where she had kept them for nearly 60 years. Her daughter, who had heard stories about the Texas camp throughout her childhood, read through them with tears streaming down her face. She was struck by how young her mother's handwriting looked in the early letters, uncertain and frightened, and how it grew stronger and more confident as the correspondence continued. She was moved by her grandmother's words, the desperation and love that poured from every line. And she understood, reading these fragile pages written in the midst of history's greatest conflict, that her mother had been shaped fundamentally by the experience of being allowed to write home. That permission, granted by an enemy who chose decency over cruelty, had changed everything. It had kept a family connected. It had shattered propaganda. It had preserved humanity in a time designed to destroy it. A piece of paper and a stamp, her daughter thought, holding her mother's letters to the light. Such small things, such enormous consequences. The legacy lived on in archives and memories, in the children and grandchildren of women who had cried when given paper, in the continued friendship between nations that had once tried to destroy each other. The letters remained, yellowed but legible, testament to a simple truth, that even in war, especially in war, the human need to reach out and connect cannot be fully suppressed. Give people paper and let them write home, and you give them something more powerful than any weapon. You give them hope. You give them dignity. You give them a reminder that they are human and loved and remembered. And sometimes, if history is fortunate, you give them the beginning of peace. The German women who cried in a Texas camp in 1944 and 45 had not known they were part of something larger than their individual griefs and joys. They had simply wanted to tell their mothers they were alive. But in doing so, they had helped write a different kind of history, one where mercy left marks deeper and more lasting than any bomb. The letters proved it. Across all the years and all the distance, the letters proved it still.